So this framing, you know, this like motherhood and apple pie. What are you going to, like somebody's like, oh, well, I totally disagree with that. It's critical, though. That framing is absolutely critical. And another how that came out of this was that, you know, you got to make it personal. So that's what the stadium example was, but let me show you how I connect that even further. So my primary conclusion was exponential systems speed up. A prediction that comes off of that is that when events unfold, they're going to unfold really rapidly. Therefore, I hold this personal motto. I'd much rather be a year early than a day late. Right? So that's, again, it's taking lessons that are already out there from the political people know all about how to pull our strings, and the advertising people know all about. And I used to shy away from it because it sounded manipulative, but it's not actually. It's just understanding that we don't take in information. We gather supporting bits of data that support our existing belief systems. I do it. You do it. The people you're going to talk to are going to do that. So the question becomes not what's the right information to give to this person. The right question to ask is what belief systems is this person holding? That's the critical question. Because once you have that, now you can start to figure out which data is going to be more effective, which will be less effective, how to organize it, all kinds of things can flow from that. So your work is absolutely not just essential, but it's urgent. This idea that we're going to have another 20, 30, 40 years that look a lot like the last 20, 30, 40 years may be true, but it might not. And if it's not, it means that the best days are the ones that are yet to come, but they're going to be, the next ones are going to be easiest. If the world I'm talking about comes to pass, we have less and less net energy, we'll just find ourselves less and less able to do the things we want to do. There will be fewer options, less technology, all of that. We still have incredible resources today. There's a lot we can do. And so hopefully this was in my own really quirky, weird pep talk. Go, be successful at what you do, but think, if you can, very carefully about how you say things, more so than what you say. Thank you.
To entertain a few questions. This is a crazy long space.
Long time that a system that has infinite growth can't survive. There isn't a model in nature where any system grows indefinitely. So my question to you is how do we have, as you call it, negative growth? How do we get to a point where we want less, as individuals and as a society?
So how do we get to a point where we want less? There's a couple of things. The most immediate challenge, the key driver for every single one of those exponential charts I showed you is population. And I had an odd coincidence where yesterday I interviewed a guy named Bill Ryerson, and today I sat with his sister at lunch. Totally unknown that this was going to happen. And Bill works on population issues, and what was really uplifting about that conversation with him was, it's a very challenge-loaded conversation. I actually had the opportunity 4 years ago to speak at one of his events down in Washington, and what was really observable to me about that was that not a single environmental group was there, not one, talking about population issues. And they won't come because it's the second, third, fourth, fifth rail. Like, it's just so emotionally charged, they won't touch it, right? Even though inarguably it's the most important thing. And so I asked Bill about that, and I said, what's really, like, because people think that this is going to become somehow sexist, racist, draconian, eugenics, something. It invokes all of this massive stuff. And he said, well, that's interesting because there have only been 2 coercive cases we know about out there so far. One, the opposite ends. One was China's one-child policy, which was very coercive. And the other was the opposite of that, was Romania's as many child as you can policy, where Ceausescu took away birth control and planning. And they ended up with orphanages as a consequence of that. And he said what they've learned is that persuasion works great. There are lots of ways to persuade people that family planning works, and there are now countries, Thailand being one, that have achieved stable population. They, through an active set of policies, have brought their population growth down to replacement rates. And you can, through policies, tune your replacement rate or even slightly below. you wanted to. And these are all things that can be done through persuasion and ways that tell us that this leads to a higher quality of life. And it's simple things like getting women to have children later and to space them out a little bit more. Those two things right there automatically bring your fertility rates down. And so there are things that we can do right away, and the question isn't, so I showed you phosphate, right? And so one of his examples was that India is adding 18 million people per year, and they're drawing down their aquifers in their main grain regions at 10 feet per year, and these two things cross horribly, not that many years into the future. And they know that. And so the question isn't, do we lack good information, or do we lack knowledge about how to amend the situation? Something else is missing still in this story. And it's that last piece that is unclear to me, how really we're going to affect that at the huge global change levels. But there are things that we can do that are positive, that are easy, that are straightforward, that make sense. They make social sense, economic sense, political sense, and yet we still don't do them. And so for me, my work is then, I think what I settled on is we have to change the narrative, because it's the story we're running that shapes the behaviors. And so the question is, how do we get a new narrative in play? And there I'm stumped, but trying.
Thank you. Thank you. You said that it was critically important that people have a sense of agency, which I took to mean that people have a sense of control over. Okay, so given that people are not corporations, how do people do the deed? We are facing corporate powers that seem to control so much of our policies regarding the environment. So, would you comment on that?
Well, so corporations, of which I've worked for several, they're just people. A whole collection of people, and they're shaped by this thing called the profit motive. And as long as we have a profit motive that requires growth, we'll get exactly what we have. To get it back down to the personal level, what can we do about that? I think Francis Moore LePay said it best, which is every time you buy something, you vote. You're casting a vote. And so a lot of times in this story, when I first tell it, people get a sense of urgency and they say, what do I have to prepare? What should I get? And that's fine. After we get them down off the tree limb, the second question is actually more important, which is what can I do without? Because there's a lot we can do without in this story. But we've been marketed to and culturated that it's about what we have. So it's odd. The people with the largest sense of scarcity that I go to when I talk anywhere in the world are United States citizens, and we have the most stuff. It's a really bizarre thing. And so it's cultural, it's marketing, it's all sorts of things. But it's absolutely, I think, once we can break the mindset of saying, that's what we have to break, is that consumer mindset. That our happiness comes from what we have, rather than having what we want. Right? So that's the part that has to happen there. And the most important part of the story, though, the thing that people need the most, is emotional resilience. Because when economic declines, or God forbid, collapses happen, it's not that itself that hurts people. It's their response to it. We've had one major superpower collapse in the world, USSR, late 80s, devolved into Russia and the satellite states. In Russia, in the 8 years following the collapse, 54% of all deaths that were recorded were due to alcohol. Now, they have a drinking problem there anyway, but this was way above norm. And what happened there, and they had government housing and government food, nobody was starving to death, nobody was out on the street, and yet people lost that personal, particularly middle-aged men, lost that sense of purpose. It was their response to losing their job, not the loss of the job, that was actually the most destructive event. So when I say emotional resilience, I'm saying we have to get ready for the idea that if we interpret these changes that happen as loss, then we're going to experience them extraordinarily badly and probably react to them in poor ways. And that's already happening in this country. Suicides last year overtook car deaths as the leading cause of accidental death, or non-normal death, whatever you call it, in the United States. This is with just a recession, right? So really the question is, what can people do? It's understand that you're voting every time you buy something. We need a lot less stuff than we used to. And by the way, learning how to be totally happy with less stuff, that's the most important thing. And anybody of any means can do that, whether they're urban, rural, poor, rich, doesn't matter. That's an entirely different conclusion.